Are doing it today. Welcome, everybody. Happy Sunday, and welcome to my channel. This is Margaret. Speculative fiction sometimes. Author. And I'm reading that to make sure I don't flub up my lines. So, Sunday. What do I have for you today? Well, if you didn't see the thumbnail and you're just dropping into the live, I do AuthorTube content, I do Booktube content, and I was worried. My normal time is Sundays at noon Pacific, and I realized there's a big thing going on today that has to do with the sport ball. Maybe I shouldn't try to compete with that because my video won't do very well and no one will see it. Then I thought, well, my next video is supposed to be on research reads. That is not an overlapping audience. I think I'll be okay. I think I'll be okay with my history nerds coming by and watching afterwards if you're also football fans. So I'm going to dive in and wrap up 3 recent research reads that I had from the library. I need to do this before I go on my research trip because I will have to return them. And I'm going to be using my photo library to look at the quotes that I'm going to share because obviously I couldn't annotate in the library books. And yeah, so it'll be a little rambly while I find the exact right line, but there's lots of good stuff. So basically, how this happened, let me check with my outline to make sure I don't miss something here. This is how it started, and then I'll tell you how it's going. How it started was I was participating in the Irish Readathon last year. So last year I was sort of stalled with my work in progress, and it was a Chicago novel around 1893, and it just was not going anywhere. So I was participating in the Irish Readathon, which meant reading books by Irish authors, and this one really fired my imagination. Irish Hunger, Personal Reflections on the Legacy of the Famine, edited by Tom Hayden. And he's an Irish American. He's also famous for some other things. But it got me thinking about, earlier causes and social movements and intergenerational trauma and all these interesting concepts that we are still dealing with today. So for NaNoWriMo camp, I did a bunch of short scenes that were just basically playing on all the moments that I picked up from that research book. So my imagination was really firing on Irish American. And of course, because I've studied Scottish culture so much, I was trying to see how they might have interacted, because different groups, different minorities in a culture with grievances and oppression are both struggling for their voices and in the same space. So, what could possibly have happened? So, you take a history nerd, you add a bit of Irish history, and a lover of all things Celtic, and this is what you get. You get 30 different short story scenes from different eras in the 19th century, mostly. And then what am I going to do with it then, right? So I basically use this as my jumping off point for more research. And so November, I did some work piecing together which scenes I wanted to smush together, right? So I had all these different time periods. I had just picked 1839, 1847, 1851. I just sort of went by my impressions of the period and when different moments had happened. They were all over the place. What I realized was that I was sort of trying to choose between 2 points in time, like the 1840 pivot point where it was right before the famine and the Reform Bill and lots of interesting things happening in London, and the 1880s to 90s where it was the land war and lots of different interesting things happening in British politics. And so I chose one and went with it. So now I'm sort of dealing with editing that piece and trying to get some more solid ground under its feet before I edit it and actually add to it so I don't add crap that I have to take away. So that is where I am. And what I did was do a bunch of Google searches trying to figure out which moments in history are the most interesting, have the most zhuzh, as Cat Paw Rosales might say. And I actually wrote to a museum that I am intending to visit on my research trip in Saltcoats or Ardrossan. I think it's right on the border. I'm not sure which town it's in. The North Ayrshire Museum of Heritage and Culture, I think it's what it's called, and asked about research reading, what they had in their collection that I might be able to look at when I'm there. And they give me a list of resources. So I looked some of those up and got them from the library here so I could do pre-gaming research. So this is what I'm wrapping up today. And I'll go, let's see, judging by how my photos are arranged, I will go early to most recent. Okay. So let me say hi to the chat that came in and direct your attention to the live poll. I asked, what kind of nerd do you identify as? And again, only 4 choices, so you can add your own. Shannon was here and made friends with the like button. She was first, and I think I saw the first vote come in for fantasy nerd. Not a surprise. So Shannon says, yeah, I had my author for Charmed chats choose 5 p.m. my time, which is half an hour before the Super Bowl starts. So facing the same thing. Well, at least you knew when it started. I clueless. I'm like, isn't it all day? Isn't it an all day thing? Cool Gamer was here to say hello. RC Scott was here to say hello. He identifies with horror, comics, anime, and Lord of the Rings nerdery. Yeah. I have, let's see, what are the choices? Fantasy, yes. Tech, gaming, no. History, academia, yes. Cosplay, crafty, wannabe, but no. So, oh my gosh, all 4 votes are for fantasy right now. Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to leave it up to see if anyone else can like rock the boat, but that's fun. Yeah. So what kind of nerdery do you identify with? So starting early, and what's interesting is that the field of like a research into social movements and British politics, especially in Scotland in the 1830s and 40s, is so specialized that like the 3 resources that I'm going to share with you today a little bit are they reference each other. So like everyone knows the main players, and you'll see that in the earliest book from 1943 by James Handley, this gets mentioned later. And I just thought that was interesting that it's like everyone knows the big guns. We've all decided. Yeah. Wannabe, LOL. I know. I earlier had the great good luck of working in a costume shop, so I've got lots of bits and bobs that I sometimes switch out and swap into to like make something, but it's not me being handy or crafty at all. I would say samesies with an S on the end. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, nerdery. So let's dive into my first research treasure. It's the Irish in Scotland, 1798 to 1845. And can anyone tell me, class, why those dates might be important in Irish history? This is the one by J.E. Handley and quoted later. So, member of the Institute of Marist Brothers. So I think that means he's a religious layperson of some kind. Published by Cork University Press, and I got my copy from Cal State Fullerton, which hopefully is out from being underwater at this point. So the Irish in Scotland from 1798, when there was a rebellion, and that's where we get Wolfe Tone, the legendary hero, and it also made me explore some different places in Ireland. And so that was one big exodus, right? People were caught, the rebellion was put down, the French ships didn't come, big failure. So a lot of people were executed and a lot of people emigrated because they were persona non grata in Ireland. So that led to a big emigration to Scotland for people who were trying to make a better life for themselves. So in this book, I'm going to look at the photos here. We get a lot of reporting of statistics. This is like lots of quotes from newspapers, lots of statistics from government reports. And basically, Handley was looking into what kind of effect did Irish emigration have in this 40-ish year period on Scotland. And so we got a lot of great background. A couple of the first things that I put in here to like generalize without a quote he talks about migration, and a lot of his examples reminded me of how we speak about Mexican immigration to the US. Because they come as laborers, they aren't expected to stay, they are expected to move up the ranks. They're often actively discouraged from settling in and accessing benefits and stuff like that. And accessing benefits is a big hobby horse of this author. One of the later books says he's rather defensive because of the age or the time period. And I think I can see that what he is defensive about is that claims have been made about the Irish's influence on Scotland's politics or history. One of them, which is pretty interesting, is that if it wasn't for the Irish laborers at this point, we would have had a great Marxist future. Like, they didn't join into the trades unions. They weren't invited. And so that's why we couldn't get the votes for this, or couldn't have this big demonstration to, become the Labour Party before the Labour Party was a thing or whatever. And so that's an interesting what if. And the other one is just about economic depression. So this is where I was seeing parallels with Mexican immigration to the US and reactionary arguments about that, because a lot of people complain that when Irish immigrants were in the parishes of southern Scotland, the lowlands of Scotland, they were just coming for benefits. And I will read a funny quote about that in a second. And they were, jacking up the tax rates, what they call the poor rates in that day, and, taking away the jobs from the native Scots. Does any of this sound familiar? So that was the big parallel, like alarm bells going off in my head. They have mention of the canal building and the railroad building of this time period, the first half of the 19th century. Of course, big public works time period and expansion of these big projects, but they needed a lot of like ditch diggers. And interesting thing was they used the Highland sort of immigration, the desperation of the Highlanders getting kicked off their land, which I go over in my books, starting with the Keening, and said, well, we need public works projects to provide work for all these people who now don't have their own crofts or farms. And then what happened is they didn't want to work as ditch diggers, or they didn't think that was the future for them. So they left the island and went to Canada or America. And so they didn't have that labor force, but hey, look, here are all these Irish people. Let's use them. So like crazy. It talked about the truck system. So for anyone familiar with early labor movements in the US, the company store and like getting cheated out of a lot of things because you can only pay in credit, and then your prices are jacked up, and it's not legal, but they figure out ways around it, and your job feels less secure because of this system. So not a great situation. It talks about handloom weaving versus cotton mills. So if you're a fan of North and South, like I am, especially the movie adaptation with Richard Armitage, you know that 1850s kind of era is when industrialization was kicking up and lots of mills were going on. And it was a very hard transition from people coming into the country, getting used to and adapting themselves to factory life, to mill life, and no health and safety laws, no protections, and accidents happened, things went up in flames, etc. So the native Scots, in this case, did not like to work in the factories because they considered it beneath them. They had a grand history of decades and decades of fine weaving in their home. So they were contractors for themselves. They would do the hand loom weaving in the basement. They would have their wives working on spinning things to provide for the weaving and send it out, and commanded a pretty good wage that way. And these people come along and want you to go to their place for 12, 13 hours and take a break when they want you to take a break, and go through all these rules with these conditions. And they're like, I don't think so. So again, oh, hey, look, this big pool of Irish labor with lots of children that will grow up not knowing anything different. And so desperate people make good employees for something that isn't exactly a catch of a job in that time period. So that was another big change. James Handley also highlights a lot the difference and not being able to capture the differences between the Catholic Irish that came over and the Protestant Irish. The Protestant Irish went to different places and they mixed in differently. So if you were Protestant Irish, you were most likely from the 6 northern Ulster counties, and you were likely sort of a Scots-Irish descendant. And so when you came back into Scottish culture, you were maybe in the right religion to fit in better, and so you didn't stick out as much. So when people counted things in that day, they would often just count religion and say, are you Catholic or are you Presbyterian? And if you were Presbyterian but Irish, they didn't capture you in the statistics as an immigrant when people 100 years later look back, So interesting, research tidbits there on religious differences. Most of the Irish Catholics went to Liverpool and Manchester. Some stayed in Ayrshire, and most of the Protestants went to Dundee, to the East Coast. So it's interesting, you stick with the community you came with because you can all help each other survive together. And so that affects settlement patterns, but yeah, religion, settlement patterns in Scotland. And the reactionary wave. So yeah, moral degradation. So you had people in Scotland blaming collapse of morals in Scotland on the Irish immigrants. They stole our jobs. They're making our wages decrease. And for fans of Newsies, a historical fiction Disney movie near to my heart, there are actually places in this time period that were called the House of Refuge, that were poor workhouses. And so that was a perfect bring it back to my writing roots with the Newsies reference. So yeah, that is what he treated. He looked at religious differences, the reactionary wave, the industries they were going into, the price effects, and the benefits they were getting. And so the defensiveness about were Irish getting on rolls, I will find and read that passage to you after I check in with the chat. So let's see. Oh, insults. Let's not read the insults. It's on the left side of the page. Here we are. Okay, so page 186. This is the nerdery. This is what you're here for. Okay. This accusation, which is repeated ad nauseum in the writings of the day, of immigrants digging themselves in stubbornly for 3 years in order to reap financial benefit at the end of that period, argues an incredible combination of foresight and stupidity on their part. That immigrant casual laborers and poor persons of all kinds, existing from hand to mouth and unable by their very circumstances to take thought for the morrow, could be honestly credited by their critics with the provision to pay their way in a parish at all costs for 3 years, so that they might relax at the end of that time, is too naive for credence, especially as it was notorious that Irish immigrants with a legal sediment had to fight for their rights, and if successful, could look forward to no more substantial support than a half-crown a month, unless they submitted to incarceration in the workhouse. So, again, this is what was drawing me toward the parallels with Latin American immigrants to the US. Oh, they're just getting here to get on welfare. And you're like, do you know how much welfare gives? And Do you know how they live until they get there? Like, are they subsisting on air? So that just stood out to me, and I thought that was one of those light bulbs for like what I'm going to be writing in my historical fiction. So that was the first book. And Shannon says, I want more costume stuff. Yeah. Yeah, 1845. So she got the 1845 date, and I forgot to mention it, but Shannon got it for me. Thank you. RC says, I'm also a nerd about food. I like it. I like it. British rule. I'm not sure what that was about because I think I took too long to respond. Sorry. Okay. First book. Second book by publishing order. This is Irish Immigrants and Scottish Society in the 19th and 20th Centuries, Proceedings of the Scottish Historical Studies Seminar from the University of Strathclyde, 1989 to 90. Like classic academic tome kind of journal bound text. So overall notes. This is edited by a very famous writer. So the University of Strathclyde is in Glasgow, and Tom Devine, is a very prolific writer on Irish and Scottish history on the island of Britain. And so his name has just popped up all over. So I'll probably be reading more of his work. But this is, I think he was teaching a seminar, and then people in the seminar also contributed essays to this. So what did I find in this? It's not an essay collection because that makes it sound like memoirs. But yes, academic journal. There we go. So lots more parsing of religious causes and influences of effects. Also, philosophical questions of integration and who influenced whom. So when you talk about the Irish coming to Scotland and settling and what influence did they have on Scottish history, it's like, well, did the Irish influence this, or did the Scottish influence the Irish, or did they create a new thing? So he got a little philosophical on that, and I wasn't sure I could abstractify it as much at my level. For my purposes, the most interesting essay was the last, and I'm going to go back and reread it, obviously, from my photo notes, but let's skip forward to this one. Lots of interesting things, but okay, so here's another interesting quote from earlier in the book. The Irish invasion added to the confusion and vague sense of menace, and according to one historian, may have been crucial in leading to the rehabilitation of Highland culture and ways, so as to provide, in a highly romanticized form, a new focal point for Scottish identity from which the Irish were excluded, even though they were more representative of older Highland ways than the stereotypes being created for a lowland and emigre market. So that may be a bit in the weeds for folks, but if you take my books as a starting point of like a base of knowledge, you know that Highlanders were getting kicked off their farmland was being consolidated, big landowners, absentee, just wanting sheep to be there and be cheap and just raise profits so that they could spend it in London and be grand lords and ladies. And so what they're saying is that the Highland way of life, of like crofting and certain cultural practices and, ways of interpreting religion and character, that was sort of getting lost because these people had to immigrate to cities and make hard choices about working in a factory or emigrating to try to find different farmland to call their own. And so with that sort of dispersion in effect, you had the Irish coming over and, if you've got a comparison culture, if you've got people who are more alien than the Highlanders in your lowland towns, then they band together and they want to preserve what they have. And that sort of feeling. So the native Scots there in that situation probably did more work to preserve what was theirs because they felt like they were competing. I think that's what the book is trying to say. This talks more about later because it's the whole century. Oh, here's a cool moment. So on page 48, emigration lists for the counties of Londonderry and Antrim have been extracted from the Ordnance Survey memoirs and recently published. So they talk about this as a source, and I was like, Ordnance Survey memoirs? What is this? So I looked up, I know what the Ordnance Survey is. That's where a bunch of people went out and surveyed the land, and they made these really awesome maps that are really detailed and that you can take as tourist maps anywhere you go on the tiny little roads in the UK, which is great. They attempted to do this in Ireland at one point and ran out of money, figured, fuck it, it's not going to help anyway. We don't need to know this place as well. And then people just like had started data sets and like written about things like cultural things, like local landmarks, local legends, and it just sort of sat. And it was like, hiding in an attic somewhere. I just recently watched I don't want to blank on her name. Lisa in Bookland, who is one of the co-hosts for the Irish Readathon this year. And she just mentioned a book that was a historical fiction book that was based on someone's experience in the Ordnance Survey memoirs. So I wrote her on Instagram and said, wait, is this what you were talking about with that book? And she's like, yeah, that's so crazy. So we both connected this like old historical source in like within a day of like reading about it or filming it. And I thought that was so cool. So light bulb moment for the history nerds in the house. That was fun. So yeah, Ordnance Survey memoirs, that would be a really awesome, source to toddle through and grab interesting things from. I already talked about that. I'm not going to go into the Henry George right now. Let's see. Oh, come on. Okay, so that's it because this was stretching the whole century. I had less to go into. Yeah, and it's more philosophical. So I'm going to have to read the last chapter again because that's talking about radicalism in a Scottish context. And now that I've read the other sources, I think I'll be able to maybe understand a bit more of this one. So that is the second book. And I'm just going to close the poll so I can say you're all fantasy nerds. That's fine. That's fine. I don't feel outnumbered. I'm not the native Scot feeling like I need to dig in and talk about history nerdiness. Okay, I am glad you're here listening to me be excited about my nerdy things. So the last one is the most recent publication date. It's Scotland and the Abolition of Black Slavery, 1756 to 1838. And so most of the 18th century stuff is 1770s, 80s, and it's sort of like slowly ramping up changes in thought based on Enlightenment thought towards abolition. And let me just clear up something quickly here. When I read The Black Ghost of Empire, it was pointed out to me something that I had never thought about before, which is that abolition is something different from emancipation. And emancipation is what we in the US are more familiar with because it's called the Emancipation Proclamation and it rhymes, so it's easy to remember. But emancipate comes from the Latin root of like to letting something go from your hand. So it really gives the feeling language-wise of like permitting something, of like an owner letting go and choosing to bestow freedom on somebody. Abolition, abolish, it just means destroy. So like this should not exist in the first place, slavery. And so we're destroying it. We are not allowing this to exist anymore. And it's not a master supplicant relationship that's implied in the word. So just know that going forward. I thought that was interesting. So We go from Enlightenment thinkers abstractly considering whether Black people have souls and, deserve freedom, which is really abhorrent to read about. And then we get to about 1800, and then we start getting people who have been in the West Indies and observed British slavery there and been like, oh, this is not Christian. This is not Enlightenment. This is not anything like we should be a part of, maybe. What do you think? And talking about it. And so this is another like imagination sparker. Not anything I'm like planning to incorporate, but like lots of interesting stories, lots of interesting personalities. I kept looking up the names of the people mentioned because obviously this person, Ian White, knows the names like the back of his hand, but I've never heard of most of these people before, or if I have, it's only in passing. So my phone, which was handiest, is now full of open tabs with like Wikipedia entries on random 19th century British dudes, and they're all dudes. And yeah, so lots more to look into, but let's dive into the outline of what I had from this. So Ian White's book, and it goes to 1838. It was published in 2006. 1838 is because that is the day that slavery officially ended, including the apprenticeship system. So if you don't know what the apprenticeship scheme is, again, can't recommend The Black Ghost of Empire by Chris Manjapra enough as a book. Really, really eye-opening. But in the case of British Empire slavery, they thought they had it cracked in 1833. They had 1807 abolished the slave trade. 1833 abolished slavery with a plan to have apprenticeships to get Black folks ready for freedom, because if you just give it to them, emancipate, there will be chaos. They won't know what to do. They'll starve. All these ridiculous things just to slow down the process and let the slave owners have as much profit as they could going on. So that only lasted 4 years until 1838. And there was just too much ruckus. There was too much like, what do you think you are doing, British Empire, from the Caribbean colonies? And they finally said, okay, fine, here you go. Here's the keys. And averted like mass rebellions and, probably killings and troops being deployed and all that stuff. So very exciting in the 1830s in the Caribbean. Not in a good way. Yeah, Shannon says, I like the word abolish better. It's very actiony. It's very good. Yes. And Eloise is here. Yeah, 100%. I'm not watching that. Sport ball. Okay, so Scotland and the abolition of Black slavery. My notes. So it starts with baptism and slavery, and the argument whether if you are baptized, you can continue being a slave, because then you're a child of God, and doesn't that carry freedom? And they somehow slimily moved right past that and had slave owners in the Caribbean mass baptizing people and not giving them Sundays off. And this was like a tiny little burr of contention, but it wasn't enough to get anyone off their high horse. Then we've got enlightenment and slavery, which is like considering the abstract questions, like I said, which is like really annoying even to read about. Then we've got a whole log, like a whole chapter about how many petitions came from Scotland. And apparently this is a big thing. So petitions today in the US online are like, I don't think anyone thinks they do much, right? Like you can lend your support to something, but unless you're actively calling your representative, I don't think signing a petition does much on other than like get you on a call list for money later. But in this era, the petitions that people are talking about go to Parliament and are basically like one of the sole forms that you can get popular input, because nobody's popularly elected. Everyone gets paid for their vote or is a self-interested landowning rich dude, right? So petitions were ways that organizations, and this is any type of organization, church, state, industry, what have you, can write in and be heard in Parliament. If you write a petition, you have to be literate. If you get someone to write a petition for a group of people, you get signatures, you send it to Parliament, it makes it to London. That is the first barrier, and is read out. It is getting put into the public discourse, and it's on public record, which is fantastic for us 200 years later. Talking about petitions, he also talks about, Ian White talks about London Scots. So not just in Scotland, but a lot of Scots who were in London were on committees, were parts of organizations that were organizing. That was redundant. Were parts of groups that were activist and organizing and getting petitions and pulling up data and responding to editorials in the papers and all this kind of stuff. And so we got a little bit of the background on some of them, which is why I have their Wikipedia entries open on my phone. There was a big Napoleonic War period in here, which really messed up any sort of internal empire questions. So slavery was put on hold. Slavery question, I should say, was put on hold while they were fighting with France. What further complicated it is that when it was Republican France for a few years, they abolished slavery in the French Empire, but then Napoleon came along and he reinstituted it. And so then you've got the British going like, okay, so that was unstable. We don't want your slaves to be free because that's unstable for us. And then now you're reinstating it, but you're Napoleon and you're at war with us. So we don't like you, but we like your politics. Like very, very gray area. So exciting to read about, but very murky, like morally and politically. And then we've got gradualism, which I came across again in the Black Ghost of Empire, was the argument that you needed to give slaves their freedom, give from the hand gradually so that they would be used to it. And this guy called Andrew Thompson came along, who was a Presbyterian preacher, and he was not having it. And I think that is the excerpt I'm going to read from this one. Let me find the paper in my photos here. Let's see. Okay. Is this? Yes. Okay. It's one of, there might be, I have two parts of this. So as a Presbyterian preacher, he's obviously bringing the religious theme in as part of his justification. Thompson cited the views of a Mr. Hines in Barbados, who claimed that all the evils of slavery are abstract and all its blessings positive. So, bleh. He suggested that this might be the source of Combs' contention, which is a side thing, and continued. What he calls an abstract principle is nothing more nor less than this, that to make any man a slave or to keep him a slave is to violate his essential rights, to transgress eternal justice, to break the first laws of religion and morality. There is nothing abstract in this. To adopt the views which Mr. Combs seems to avow would, in my opinion, lay every moral obligation at the feet of worldly expediency. Ding, ding, ding. That we should obey the will of the Almighty and that we should not continue to do what he has forbidden is not an abstract principle. It is a concrete principle forever dwelling in the Christian's mind, pressing upon his conscience and influencing his conduct. Slavery, being in direct hostility to that will and an impious defiance of it, is a crime which must be immediately and unreservedly abandoned, as much at least as any other species of criminality whatever. And I was like, yes, because you're playing around with people's lives. And so like calling it criminality, I think was a really intentional dig. And I loved Andrew Thompson for this. So very cool. Let's see. Missionaries. Oh, okay. So let me find the other piece to that. He also goes to talk about whited sepulchres, which is a phrase I'd heard of, but I didn't, I guess I could have guessed it was from the Bible, but I didn't remember that. So, it's a sepulchre full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Oh, so good. Let's see. A verbal picture. Okay, here we go. He then gave a verbal picture that was to be translated into graphic illustration and borrowed by later generations of abolitionists on both sides of the Atlantic. I should read this from the book because it's like slanting into the middle. It's making it hard to read. While I still have the book. Why, sir, slavery is the very upas, I don't know, this is a biblical term, upas tree of the moral world, beneath whose pestiferous shade all intellect languishes and all virtue dies. And if you would get rid of the evil, you must go more thoroughly and effectively to work than you can ever do by these palliatives, which are included under the term mitigation. The foul sepulchre must be taken away. The cup of oppression must be dashed to the ground. The pestiferous tree must be cut down and eradicated. It must be, root and branch of it, cast into the consuming fire, and its ashes scattered to the four winds of heaven. It is thus that you must deal with slavery. You must annihilate it now, and annihilate it forever. So this guy with his smashing speech, like, that's basically like the turning point, according to this book, for the argument for gradualism. So he really helps in 1832-33, like, get people on board with this, like, now and forever it needs to be done. Yeah. And then there's the compensation thing. So I don't know if you guys know or follow the headlines, but I was really struck. I was probably late. The headline was from 2015, and it was like the London, I don't remember what the UK papers are called. Big UK paper. Anyway, it came up with the headline about 2015 being the year that all the slavery compensation was finally paid off. So in 1833, in order to get slavery abolished, this is going to blow your minds. In order to get slavery abolished through Parliament and passed, instead of compensating the people who were enslaved for their years of hardship and beatings and murder and sickness and non-freedom they didn't deserve, the political necessity was paying the people who were losing property so that they could let it go through. It just boggles my mind how all the petitions, I was telling you about the petitions earlier that went to Parliament, many of them had compensation schemes for the enslaved folks who were going to be set free, like your 40 acres and a mule kind of thing, which didn't happen in the US. So, but what happened instead is that the people in Parliament said, oh, well, I think who really needs to be compensated are the plantation owners. And so 20 million pounds is like billions and billions of dollars in 1833 pounds. And they take out these loans and they pay out to plantation slavery families for 100 years. And it has interest and it keeps accruing interest. And so from 1833 until 2015, that principal was still being paid off. Can you imagine that? Anyway, so that was interesting to see, like, how it was originally one way and then like Parliament like rejiggers it and turns it into this terrible like backwards compensation scheme, which like many later generations ended up paying for. Kind of like how climate pollution is gonna end up being, I think. Anyway, just digressing there for a second. So that was really cool to learn about. And then let me look back at my photo favorites here. Oh, yeah, Andrew Thompson, badass. Let's see. And I really want a little bit more detail about what happened in the Parliament, which is why I'm reading Greville's memoirs right now, because so the reason abolition could go through in 1833 was partly because of the Reform Act of 1832. So still in this book, I'm using this quote. Far more significant for abolitionists was the Reform Act of 1832. In the election of December 1832, the extended franchise, because the Reform Act made it possible for more regular people to vote instead of big landowners, it produced a House of Commons that reduced West Indian representation, and they don't mean like West Indian people of color, they mean West Indian plantation owners, of course, at this time, to 35, while at the same time including over 100 members pledged to immediate abolition. So because you diluted the power of the plantation owners, ding, 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 future strategy, that was how they were able to finally push through abolition, or at least a contributing factor, which I thought was fascinating. I'm taking notes. Yes, I am. So yeah, things like the only way to secure the safety and tranquility of the West Indies was immediately to emancipate the slaves. No recorded petitions argued for compensation, except for the slaves. Strathblane wanted to see compensation paid for the floggings, oppressions, and mutilations which they have sustained from their masters. The Glasgow Political Union expressed anxiety that any compensation for the planters would add to the pecuniary burdens of the already impoverished people of this country, and declared its opinion that traffickers in the flesh and blood of their fellow creatures are not entitled to any compensation whatsoever. Sounds good, right? So yeah, people did know better in that time period, but the magic of legislatures, what can we say? Yeah, Shannon says, I believe it, the way they change it. Yeah, meddling. And then the final point that was interesting, and I am in no position to write a story based in the Caribbean. I've never been there. I don't know much about it. But it's interesting to me that the missionary society there was not aligned with the abolitionists. So we ordinarily think of the religious people being the front banner holders of the abolitionist cause. But because the people sending the missionaries there valued the souls, the spiritual health of the slaves there more highly, and their missions more highly than they did their freedom, they didn't want to get in trouble with the planters, the plantation owners. So they said, you have to be neutral. You cannot speak on any of these things. You're only administering to the spiritual health of the enslaved people on the plantations. And so they could not align. They were not on the same committees. They were not allowed to do any of the activities that the abolitionists, who did not live on the island, obviously they would have been in danger if they were there from assassination. So it's like really tense, lots of moments of conflict, and like really rich sort of historical fiction area for what was going on back in London. What did they know? What secrets were being kept? Like what trust was betrayed with like different political affiliations. So that's the part that I'm like getting a little invested in. And that was pretty interesting. So there we have it. These 3 books have yielded a lot more questions, but also a lot like more narrow directions, which is the purpose of reading widely in your research area. And my aim now, let's see, what did I say? To weave together tales from the front lines of fights for decency, freedom, and opportunity. Maybe I'll put that on a graphic somewhere. But yeah, that's what I'm looking to do. And the 1798 date was where I started with like my timeline. So I've got like this like family timeline I'm trying to put together to plan the series. And so I've got people leaving at the 1798 period who are brothers, and then their daughters each have a story, and then their grandkids each have a story, but they're in different places. So you're kind of still getting a family saga, or like, standalone in the same universe kind of fiction. But I haven't planned out a series like this before, so who knows? It could all fall apart. These are just like grand plans that I'm inventing before I edit the first book. But it does have me very excited. So, I didn't put up any banners. I've just been talking this whole time. So welcome to this live wrap up of my recent research reads. If you're new here and you enjoyed this walk down history nerdery, please subscribe to my channel. I will do more of these. And thanks for watching. My next video is going to be talking about my research trip update, and hopefully I will have an update by Wednesday. So normally I come on Sundays at noon and Wednesdays at noon Pacific time, and some Friday mornings for productivity sprints. So feel free to come back and join for more history nerdery and derogatory sports ball comments. Other than that, thank you and take care. Happy reading, everybody.